The words hit the room like a slap. The police chief leaned in, his face flushed with the kind of anger that grows in the shadows of unchecked power, and jabbed a finger toward the bench as if he were aiming a weapon. "I own you, pig." The sentence hung in the air, thick and toxic, and for a moment even the cameras seemed to hesitate, their red lights blinking like stunned witnesses, unsure whether to keep recording. Every head in the courtroom turned at once, a ripple of disbelief moving through the crowd as though the floor itself had shifted. Judge Caprio didn't flinch. His eyes lifted slowly, steady, calm, the same way a father looks at a child who has mistaken cruelty for strength. But there was a flicker, just a small one, of something human. Not fear, not outrage, something deeper. A quiet sadness that a man trusted with a badge could fall so far from the oath he swore. A clerk's pen stopped mid-stroke. An officer in the back straightened as if preparing for a storm. Even reporters, trained to bury emotion, blinked at the sheer audacity of the moment. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. This wasn't just disrespect. It wasn't even just an insult hurled in anger. It was a mask slipping, revealing the rot beneath authority that had gone unchallenged for too long. In that instant, the courtroom became more than a room. It became a mirror, reflecting everything the city had refused to face. And yet, as the silence thickened, no one knew the truth that was about to break open. What happened next would expose a reality the city had ignored for years. People in the courtroom felt the shock first, but the weight of what had happened reached far beyond a single insult. A police chief isn't just another authority figure. He is supposed to be the embodiment of law and order, the anchor of public safety, the one person expected to defend the very principles that keep a community standing. And yet here he was publicly attacking a judge whose entire career had been defined by compassion, fairness, and integrity. It wasn't just inappropriate. It was a crack in the foundation of everything people believed their city still stood for. This hearing was never supposed to be explosive. It had been scheduled quietly, tucked into an afternoon docket with the kind of vague phrasing that keeps people from asking too many questions. But beneath that calm surface lived a case that had been buried, delayed, and quietly shuffled through administrative hallways. An internal affairs complaint that officers whispered about, but rarely spoke of openly. It involved allegations no one wanted to handle: abuse of power, intimidation, reports mysteriously disappearing, officers resigning without explanation. Everyone knew something was wrong. No one knew how deep it went. City Hall had dodged it. The union wouldn't touch it. Officers who tried to come forward found themselves reassigned, silenced, or pressured into backing down. The public only saw the surface. A chief who smiled for cameras and preached loyalty, and a judiciary trying to keep the ship steady in waters that were growing darker by the day. That's why the chief's eruption mattered so much. His fury wasn't random. It was fear dressed as dominance, panic disguised as authority. A man who truly believed he owned the room doesn't lash out. A man who knows his grip is slipping does. When he hurled that insult, the mask he'd worn for years cracked open, and everyone saw the insecurity hiding behind the uniform. And Judge Caprio, calm, controlled, rooted in values older than any position or title, represented everything the chief couldn't intimidate: dignity, fairness, justice, the principles that define not just a courtroom, but the American promise itself. That's why the moment struck a nerve far beyond the walls of that small chamber. It wasn't just a confrontation. It was a collision between what America hopes to be and what corruption tries to turn it into, because the truth behind this outburst was darker than anyone expected. The police chief had spent decades climbing the ranks, shaping himself into the kind of authority figure people learned to fear long before they learned to respect. He started as a patrol officer with an eagerness that looked like ambition. But even then, older officers whispered that his drive came from something colder. He wanted power, not service; control, not responsibility. And every promotion he earned only sharpened that edge. Over the years, stories began surfacing from inside the department. Officers transferring out of his command without explanation. Resignations filed quietly. sometimes with a handshake that looked more like a plea for escape. New recruits warning each other to avoid catching his attention. There were tales of closed-door meetings where voices rose, followed by sudden silences and faces drained of color. People learned early that confronting him meant risking your career worse. Citizens complained too. Though their cases never seemed to go anywhere, reports disappeared. Body cam footage was labeled corrupted. Witnesses who tried to follow up found themselves lost in a maze of paperwork and delays. Yet at community events, he stood before microphones preaching honor and loyalty, speaking as though the badge on his chest was a symbol of virtue he personally invented. Crowds clapped, unaware of the shadows stacked behind him. Behind those speeches, the truth looked very different. His reputation inside the department was built on intimidation. Promotions were traded for silence. Favors were exchanged like currency. Officers who resisted his pressure found themselves working undesirable shifts or facing disciplinary reviews pulled from thin air. His reach stretched through the precinct like a network of invisible strings, and he tugged them whenever someone stepped out of line. Arrogance followed him everywhere. He walked into rooms as though they brightened because he arrived. He interrupted colleagues mid-sentence, corrected superiors with a smirk, and expected people to shift in their seats when he passed. The badge wasn't a symbol of duty to him. It was armor-proof he believed made him untouchable. Every courtroom, every office, every hallway felt smaller when he was in it. As though he refused to share space with anyone, he couldn't bend to his will. In his mind, authority wasn't about protection. It was ownership. He believed every room he entered belonged to him. And most dangerously, he believed everyone inside it did too. Years of unchecked power convinced him he could push, intimidate, or silence anyone who threatened the image he so carefully built. But there was one flaw in his worldview, one blind spot he never accounted for. He could bully officers, he could bury complaints, he could manipulate procedure and twist protocol until the truth suffocated under paperwork. But there was one man he couldn't corner, one man he couldn't bend, one man whose calm presence made his power feel smaller every second he stood before him. He never expected a judge like Caprio. One man he couldn't silence. Judge Caprio's story didn't begin in a courtroom. It began in a small, crowded apartment where the smell of home-cooked food mixed with the sound of two immigrant parents, reminding their children that dignity mattered more than success. His father worked long hours, hands worn and calloused, yet he carried himself with a quiet pride that didn't need to be announced. He taught his son that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned through how you treated people, especially those with less power than you. His mother, gentle but unyielding, reminded him that humility wasn't weakness. It was strength forged through understanding where you came from. Caprio grew up watching his parents navigate a world that wasn't always welcoming. They fought for opportunities most people took for granted. They saved every dollar, sacrificed sleep, and whispered prayers that their children would live in a country where character meant something. From them, Caprio learned that greatness wasn't defined by rising above others. It was defined by lifting others up. When he reached law school, nothing came easy. He wasn't the wealthiest student or the best connected. He studied late, worked part-time jobs, and dealt with setbacks that would have discouraged someone with a weaker center. But every challenge pulled him closer to the values his father had passed down. While others competed to impress professors or secure elite internships, Caprio focused on understanding people, their fears, their mistakes, their humanity. He believed the law should serve the community, not intimidate it. His public service career followed that philosophy. He didn't choose the path that led to prestige or influence. He chose the path that allowed him to stand between ordinary citizens and the machinery of the legal system, often the difference between someone feeling ruined or feeling heard. Over the years, he gained a reputation not for harsh rulings or dramatic gestures, but for kindness. He listened. He asked questions no one else bothered with. He allowed space for people to explain the hardships behind their mistakes. And in those moments, he became something rare. A judge who embodied empathy without abandoning accountability. People who entered his courtroom nervous or ashamed often left with their shoulders a little straighter, their hope restored. Caprio understood that justice without compassion becomes cruelty. Accountability without respect becomes humiliation. And power, if not guided by humanity, becomes a weapon. That belief shaped every decision he made on the bench. The hearing began the way so many unremarkable cases did, quietly, almost forgettably. A modest violation sat on the docket, the kind of procedural review most people would skim past without a second thought. The room felt ordinary. A few officers seated in the back, a couple of reporters tapping notes into their phones, and Judge Caprio reviewing paperwork with the calm concentration he brought to every case. If anyone sensed tension at the outset, it was faint enough to ignore. Two men with reputations, two very different worlds, but nothing overtly unusual. At least not yet. The police chief entered with the confidence of someone who assumed the room was already his. He walked fast, shoulders squared, chin lifted just enough to make his authority feel heavy. From the moment he sat, he radiated impatience. When Caprio began outlining the matter at hand, the chief let out a small scoff soft enough to pass as exasperation, but pointed enough to send a ripple through the officers behind him. The first interruption came disguised as a question. The chief leaned forward, cutting in before Caprio finished his sentence, shifting the tone from inquiry to challenge. Caprio responded evenly, unbothered, his voice steady and unshaken. But the chief interrupted again. Then again, each time a little sharper. Each time, a little louder. The room tightened around the exchange as if the walls themselves sensed the storm building as the chief's voice rose. Caprio seemed to lower in response, not out of weakness, but control. His calmness became almost unnerving, stillness that made the chief's aggression look less like authority and more like desperation. Reporters lifted their eyes from their screens. Officers shifted in their seats. A clerk froze with her hand hovering above a file, unsure whether to continue or wait for the tension to break. The chief pushed harder, words turning sharper, tone turning personal. He challenged the judge's fairness, questioned his judgment, insinuated motives that made the crowd murmur. But Caprio didn't break. He responded with the same measured cadence, refusing to match the chief's escalating anger. The quieter Caprio became, the more unhinged the chief seemed. Authority, once his ally, began slipping through his fingers. By now, no one in the room was focused on the case. They were focused on the collision to men. Two philosophies, one space shrinking between them. Everyone sensed it. The hearing was no longer a hearing. It was a countdown. And then, right when the room reached its breaking point, one sentence shattered everything. The chief's words, "I own you, pig," hung in the courtroom like smoke from a gunshot. A ripple of shock rolled through the room. Officers shifted in their seats, tugging at their collars, unsure whether to look at the chief or pretend they hadn't heard it. A few journalists who had been lazily scrolling through their notes now snapped their cameras upright, fingers hovering over record buttons. Even the walls, old and wooden and familiar with decades of hearings, seemed to pull back in disbelief. But the most striking reaction came from Judge Frank Caprio himself. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He simply stared at the chief, calm and quiet, as though the insult had passed through him like wind through a doorway. Then he did something that made the moment even more tense. He closed the file in front of him slowly, gently, almost tenderly. A pause. A legendary Caprio pause. The kind that isn't silence, but pressure. The kind that makes the entire room lean in, unconsciously holding their breath, waiting for the verdict of history. And then he spoke. His voice was low, steady, and almost impossibly controlled. "Chief," he began, "I don't know what you believe you own, but it certainly isn't this courtroom, and it isn't me." A murmur flickered through the room like a spark. The chief's jaw tightened, but before he could jump in, Caprio raised one hand gracefully. Firmly, the chief froze mid-breath. Caprio continued, "You are here today not as a commander of men, but as a respondent in an internal affairs inquiry, a matter that, despite repeated requests from the city, has remained unanswered for over 9 months. The reporters perked up. Officers straightened. A few exchanged glances that said, "He's going there." Caprio opened a drawer beneath the bench and pulled out a thin stack of papers. They were clipped neatly. "These," Caprio said, lightly tapping the stack, "are the reports you claimed never reached your office?" A tiny, barely audible gasp came from the second row, because everyone knew the rumors, reports disappearing, complaints misfiled, cases pushed into a bureaucratic black hole. Caprio wasn't finished. "Before you accuse this court of bias, I reviewed every document myself." He held up a page. "This one is from Officer Mendez. Filed March 12th. Marked received, yet never investigated." He placed it down. "Another from Officer Ruiz. Filed June 2nd. Anonymity requested due to fear of retaliation." Sharp inhale echoed from somewhere behind the chief. "And here," Caprio said, lifting a third sheet, "is the complaint that brought you here today, submitted by 3 separate officers, independently, describing the same pattern of conduct." The chief's face paled. His lips tightened. His fingers clenched the edge of the table. Caprio leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, not theatrically. Just enough to show that, for the first time, he was stepping into the debate the chief had begged for. "You said you own me." He paused. The room held still. "But the truth, Chief, is that no one in public office owns anyone. Not a judge, not an officer, not the people who walk into this courtroom hoping the system is fair. Our power," he tapped the bench, "is not ownership. It is responsibility." Even the ceiling fans seemed to quiet themselves. Caprio straightened the papers, aligning them perfectly, a gesture so small, yet so meticulous that it felt like a warning. Then, in a tone that was almost gentle, he continued, "I have served this city for decades, and in that time, I've met officers who embodied dignity, courage, and humility. Officers who risked their lives for strangers. Officers who never once raised their voice at a judge, even when they disagreed. Those officers deserve a leader who respects them, who protects them, who listens to them." Look directly into the chief's eyes, not one who silences them. The chief swallowed. His earlier bravado was slipping bit by bit, replaced by the dawning realization that Caprio had not merely prepared for this hearing, he had anticipated this moment. Caprio lifted one final document. "This," he said softly, "is a transcript of a meeting held in your office, a meeting your attorneys claim did not occur. A meeting in which several officers expressed concerns about your conduct. The transcript," he let the page fall to the table, "was provided anonymously, and it matches the statements in all 3 complaints." A wave of whispers surged through the courtroom like a rising tide, quickly hushed by the bailiff, but Caprio wasn't finished. He placed both hands on the bench, interlocking his fingers. "Chief, you may intimidate your subordinates. You may shout down your critics. You may even believe that rank gives you the right to belittle others. But in this courtroom, rank means nothing." He let the words settle, slowly, intentionally. "In this courtroom, truth has rank." The chief opened his mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to defend himself. But Caprio raised his hand again, calm but commanding. "Allow me to finish." The chief sank back into his seat. Caprio continued, "You accuse this court of being beneath you. Yet the foundation of justice in this country is that no one stands above the law, not even those who enforce it." Spoke not to the chief now, but to the gallery, to the public, to the cameras, to the idea of integrity itself. We serve the people, not ourselves. And when we forget that, we lose more than authority, we lose trust. And trust, Chief, once broken, is harder to rebuild than any case file buried in a drawer. The chief's face was red now, not with anger, though anger simmered underneath, but with the realization that he had lost control of the moment. The courtroom he once treated like a stage for his own dominance had become a mirror. Reflecting back every misstep, Caprio leaned back in his chair, his tone cooling into something even sharper. "You came into my courtroom today, believing you could intimidate your way out of accountability? Instead, You have revealed exactly why this hearing was necessary." He gathered the papers, stacking them neatly, and for the record he added, "I am not your pig. I am a servant of this court and of the people." Silence, real silence. The kind that leaves even the walls listening. Caprio reached for his gavel, but did not strike it yet. Instead, he delivered the final, devastating line, a sentence so precise, so restrained, that it cut deeper than anything the chief had thrown. "If you truly believe you own this city's justice system, Chief, then today is the day you learn you never did." He brought the gavel down with a single, echoing crack, and when he finished, the crowd erupted. Gasps, whispers, chairs scraping, reporters rushing forward, officers exhaling the breath they didn't realize they'd been holding, and the chief, he simply sat there, staring forward, stunned, stripped of the illusion of power he had clung to for years. The moment had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it, if you want. I can now write Section 7, the fallout, Section 8, the resolution, or Section 9, outro, and CTA, matching the same dramatic style. The gavel strike was still echoing when the courtroom broke into a storm of stunned reaction. A few people gasped outright. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances that asked, "Did that really just happen?" Two officers in the back, usually stone-faced, quickly hid the beginnings of relieved smiles. The kind you show when someone finally says the thing everyone else was too afraid to say. And the chief? He sat frozen, gripping the table as though it were the only solid thing left in the room. Within seconds, a soft hum of murmurs built into a low, rolling wave. Journalists dashed toward the hallway, phones already held up, already recording, already narrating the historic blow they had just witnessed. A few even whispered the same words, "This is going to be everywhere." Because the moment the clip hit the internet, America lit up. It started small, an 18-second video posted by a local reporter covering the hearing. But within minutes, it was ripped, reposted, re-edited, and recaptioned across every platform imaginable. The hashtag Caprio moment began trending within the hour. By evening, it was in the national top 5. By midnight, #1. Memes flooded the internet. Caprio's calm stared, the chief stunned. Expression the exact moment Caprio said, "In this courtroom, truth has rank." Commentators from every corner of the political spectrum chimed in, not to argue, but to praise the restraint, the precision, the unshakable dignity with which Caprio delivered the most controlled dismantling anyone had seen in years. Talk shows replayed the clip in slow motion. Analysts broke down his tone, his posture, his timing, like it was a championship play. But the reaction wasn't just entertainment. It was emotional. Deeply emotional. Veterans posted stories about the officers they served with the honest ones, the quiet ones who never got the respect they deserved. Teachers commented about the importance of humility in leadership. Parents shared the clip with their kids, writing captions like, "This is how you handle disrespect with strength, not rage." Messages poured into the courthouse from every state, thousands, then tens of thousands. One mother wrote, "Thank you, Judge. My son wants to be a police officer. I hope he has leaders like you," a retired firefighter posted. "Integrity isn't loud. Today proved it." And then came the political shockwaves. City Hall scrambled. What had been a routine hearing, buried for months, ignored by most officials, was now the center of a national firestorm. That evening, the city council announced an emergency closed-door session. The mayor's office issued a statement that was clearly rushed, promising a comprehensive review of police leadership protocols, internal affairs. Under sudden pressure, opened a formal investigation into the chief, this time public, this time unavoidable. And as soon as the inquiry was announced, something unexpected began to happen. Whistleblowers came forward. Not just one. Not just two. A wave. Officers, administrative staff, even retired personnel sent emails. Documents, statements, many anonymous, some signed. Some spoke of intimidation. Some of retaliation. Some simply wrote, Caprio was right. The hearing was no longer a hearing. It had become a reckoning. Across the country, the clip sparked conversations about accountability, leadership, and what real authority should look like. It wasn't about politics. It was about values. The moment struck a nerve because it exposed something Americans have always cared about, dignity, fairness, justice. Without fear, this wasn't just a courtroom moment. It was a cultural moment. A reminder that integrity doesn't shout. It stands. It endures. It speaks truth even when truth shakes the room. But while the internet surged with praise, while the media called it the most powerful courtroom moment of the year, and while millions celebrated Caprio's composure, he didn't celebrate, not even for a second, as the cameras outside flashed, and reporters begged for a statement. Caprio simply walked past them, face steady, eyes thoughtful, almost troubled, because he knew something the crowd didn't. This moment wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about winning. And it wasn't over what he said next. Quietly, privately, deliberately would change everything, and that is where the final lesson begins. After the tumult had settled, Judge Caprio rose to address the courtroom not with anger, not with triumph, but with the calm clarity that had defined his career. Every eye turned toward him, every whisper stilled, as if the room itself understood that what was about to be said mattered more than any headline or viral clip. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate, resonating beyond the walls of the courthouse. Service is not a title, he began, voice steady and measured. It is a responsibility that comes with a badge, with a gavel, and with the trust of every person who walks through these doors. Authority is not a weapon, it is a duty. And if we forget that, we lose far more than respect, we lose ourselves. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle on the crowd. Officers nodded subtly, some wiping quiet tears, while the chief sat rigid, finally confronted not by anger, but by truth. Caprio continued, his tone rising not in volume, but in conviction. Power does not give ownership. A badge does not grant dominion. A title does not make one untouchable. Respect is not demanded. It is earned. Every action we take, every decision we make, is a measure of our character. And America thrives when its leaders act with humility, when they lift others rather than bend them, when they serve rather than dominate. He allowed a faint smile to touch his lips, remembering his father's lessons, the sacrifices of his immigrant family, and the values that had carried him from a crowded apartment to a courtroom of influence. I am reminded, he said softly, that fairness and dignity are not just ideals. They are the tools that shape a just society, and they are what make the American dream real for every citizen who hopes to be seen and heard. Every person in the room absorbed the weight of the moment. It was no longer about the chief, the viral video, or a single courtroom battle. It was about something larger, timeless, something universal. In the end, Caprio concluded, it wasn't the chief's anger people remembered. It was Caprio's dignity. It was the unwavering belief that integrity, patience, and respect, those are the true measures of strength. The courtroom remained silent for a heartbeat, then erupted, not in chaos, but in quiet acknowledgement. A collective understanding that the real victory had already been won, and in that silence, the lesson endured. What happened in that courtroom was more than a confrontation between a judge and a police chief. It was a battle of values. Dignity versus arrogance. Integrity versus corruption. Leadership versus empty displays of power. Judge Caprio didn't just defend a case, he defended the principles that hold communities together, the ideals that shape what it truly means to serve. This story isn't just about one moment. It's about every time someone stands up to authority with courage and calm. Every time honesty outshines intimidation, and every time integrity refuses to bend to ego. It's about the belief that respect isn't demanded. It's earned through character, through fairness, and through unwavering dedication to what is right. If you believe dignity still matters, subscribe. Be part of a movement that celebrates leadership rooted in service, not self-interest. Share this story to remind someone that true strength is quiet, principled, and courageous. Join a community that values truth, fairness, and accountability above all else, because what Judge Caprio showed that day is a lesson for all of us. That power is meaningless without responsibility, that titles are hollow without honor, and that the measure of a person isn't in what they can command, but in how they choose to act. When no one is forcing them to, this isn't just a courtroom story. It's a call to uphold what matters in our own lives, our communities, and our society. To insist on justice, to demand fairness, and to walk with humility even when the world tries to teach otherwise. Because in Judge Caprio's courtroom and in life, character always speaks louder than power.